Everyone's been asking me to cover Yakuza Like a Dragon recently, which is kinda surprising since I don't know many people who have actually seen the 2007 adaptation of the first Yakuza game. Well, since it's what the people want, I'll happily oblige. Nah, I'll quit fucking around. I know most people don't even know this film exists, but it's something I've actually always wanted to showcase in a video. I've been watching a ton of movies recently, which has made me want to take a shot at covering some of them on the channel. It kinda felt like the perfect opportunity to cover this movie for a number of reasons. People have been asking for more Yakuza content for a long time now, but lately I've been feeling nostalgic for the early years of the franchise, so I want to take you back to basics. Plus, I just think it's funny they recycled the same name when localizing the newest mainline game. If you didn't know, in Japan the game Yakuza Like a Dragon is titled Like a Dragon 7: Whereabouts of Light and Darkness. They decided to reset the naming convention here since it features a different genre of gameplay and main protagonist, instead of keeping in line with the intentions of the original title and calling it Yakuza 7. So now we're stuck with this weird middling title that didn't take the opportunity to drop the generic Yakuza name, yet still incorporates the original Japanese title of Like a Dragon. Now, Like a Dragon 8 is gonna be Yakuza Like a Dragon 2 when it comes out here, and it'll be even more confusing if the sequel doesn't even continue the same game design. Well, with the movie it works out just fine, since it's the first adaptation and adapts the first game. It was directed by Takashi Miike, a widely recognized Japanese director who has a very eclectic body of work. I don't mean that entirely in a good way, because while he has some legitimately great films like Dead or Alive and Audition, a lot of his movies are just nonsensical, and that can be really fun sometimes, but he likes to go beyond and make some pretty trashy stuff, like the live-action Terraformers. Surprisingly, Yakuza ends up being one of his better adaptations, or maybe unsurprisingly because the subject matter is so close to the types of movies he already made his name off of. Not only is the aesthetic of the series already meant to emulate Japanese crime cinema, but it wouldn't be a stretch to say the games draw from Miike's own work to begin with. The real-life location Kamurocho is based off of, Kabukicho, the red light district of Shinjuku, Tokyo, is already the central location of several of Miike's films, which derive their atmosphere and subject matter from the city's filthy underbelly. Of course, like with all art, Miike himself drew inspiration from older crime dramas for his films, but in the mid-2000s, Sega probably didn't have to think hard about who they'd like to direct this thing. I went back to watch a bunch of Miike's films for context, and was surprised to see how many actors I've seen in the Yakuza games play prominent roles in his films from the 90s. And by extension, how many actors from his films were brought in to star in this film adaptation of the games. For example, Kiryu is played by Kazuki Kitamura, who previously played the main character in Miike's own Ley Lines from 1999. I wonder if there was some kind of feedback loop where they ended up basing Kiryu's design in Zero off the way this actor looks in this film, since I've always thought his hair seemed a bit more modern in that game. Ley Lines is another film set in Shinjuku, and you'll be reminded of how authentic the games are since you'll be able to track your location through the streets at several points just based off what you know from the series. In another one of Miike's films, 2002's Graveyard of Honor, the main character reminded me of a much darker version of Majima from the first game. Just look how he fights with his pipe. And what do you know, he ends up getting the same actor to play Majima here. Wait, his actor's name is Goro too? That's pretty interesting. That film itself is a reimagining of a 1975 film of the same name, apparently based on a book based on a real historical Yakuza. Man, I'm telling you, art imitates art, imitates art, imitates art, imitates life. Point is, the Like a Dragon games are inspired by a long lineage of Yakuza crime films which Miike himself has solidified his name within. But there's a big difference between coming up with a crazy original idea for a one-off film and doing an adaptation for a big video game company like Sega. Unfortunately, the way this thing came out falls short in many ways, whether you're coming here for a good Miike film or a solid translation of the game. It technically covers the events of that source material, but the way it's presented paints a very different picture. To put things into perspective, you gotta remember that when this was made, the series was a pretty self-contained bubble. The second PS2 game came out a few months before this was in theaters, so really, their only reference point when developing this was what was established in that single original entry. They didn't have a ton of sequels solidifying that first game's events in our mind, so they play around with it pretty loosely here. Just like in the game, Kiryu is an ex-Yakuza who's just been released from prison after after 10 years for taking the blame for his boss's murder. Just as he gets out, 10 billion yen goes missing from his former clan, and he's pulled into the ensuing conflict which threatens to tear the city of Kamurocho apart. The whole thing takes place over one night when the city is experiencing a heat wave, which are two novel changes that give the film its own flair compared to the game. Having it all in one night not only keeps things dark and stylish, but makes the city feel so much more energetic. Then, due to how hot it is, everyone's sweating and short-tempered, just waiting for a fight to blow off some steam. This might sound obvious, but they really captured the aesthetic of the PS2 games, but I don't just mean they filmed it in the same city the games are based on. The lighting and color tone is pretty spot on, and avoids the clean, lens flare look the Kiwami variant of this world has. There are tons of atmospheric shots of the city, with characters just making their way from place to place, some even set to Crazy Ken Band. Yakuza 1's story combined with Yakuza 2's music? That's a yosh from me right there, buddy. The movie maintains a grittiness to it, despite not being as raw as Miike's normal output. Sega probably didn't want something too out there, so he needed to strike a balance to give them a commercial hit that wouldn't be too absurd or off-putting to general audiences. So if you're familiar with his style and are looking for more, you might find this one to be a bit too sterile, but again, that's being faithful to the games, which have never been that bloody or vulgar. Seriously, even after so many games in the franchise, they've never even come close to displaying the dark stuff some of his movies do when dealing with similar subject matter. And no, I won't explain further, but if you know, you know. For some reason, I couldn't find this movie in good quality anywhere. For the longest time, I thought it only had a DVD release, and that's the way I watched it for years, but it turns out it does have a 1080p Blu-ray from France of all places. Thankfully, it was region-free and had English subtitles, so I imported and ripped it for this video. From the start, we're dropped straight into what is essentially the middle of Chapter 4 of the game, so we don't get the context established in those first 3 chapters, including all of the necessary character dynamics from before the 10-year time skip. Tojo thugs are already hunting him down, blaming him for the missing money. Come on, you could slap a HUD on this and it would look like actual gameplay. He even learned the reverse kick. How diligent. Funnily enough, that can't be learned until Chapter 4, so it actually lines up. There are only a handful of action scenes, a few fistfights and a few gunfights. Both have solid choreography, but the hand-to-hand stuff feels more impactful. There's a sloppiness to the fights that feels true to the spirit of the game's combat, but all of the gunfire feels pretty artificial. Miike's movies have never necessarily been known for their choreography, but I think he holds his own here, tying a bit of humor into things to keep you engaged. While the game was pretty straightforward with following Kiryu throughout this ordeal, the film chooses to shift focus towards the city itself. It's less about Kiryu solving a mystery and more about all these different chaotic subplots going on at once, constantly shifting perspectives between the heroes, antagonists, and other random citizens who are tangentially related to the plot. In this way, it kinda reminds me of the structure of that old Digimon movie Our War Game, where tension is building and building amongst a bunch of different characters involved in their own conflicts at once that we're sporadically cutting between. Rather than following the story of Kiryu, you're getting this snapshot of how wild Kamurocho can be, and Kiryu is just one piece of it. It definitely feels like Miike was more interested in portraying that sense of anarchy rather than making a detailed adaptation of the game's plot. That's a cool idea in theory, but it really hinders the movie rather than letting it excel in its own way. Of course, the game often dealt with the issues of side characters, but they were through Kiryu's perspective, and we felt invested in the outcome due to their relevance to him as a character. Several of the side stories feel completely superfluous and add very little to the film, yet end up taking a surprising amount of its runtime. And that's a film that's almost 2 hours. It isn't like they had to keep it 90 minutes but still wanted to include everything. They had ample time and just used that time ineffectively, with the main plot feeling pushed to the side. A good example of a side story that helped set the tone and energy of Kamurocho would be the one about these robbers holding an office hostage while the police watch them. All that happens is they get sweatier as the movie goes along and the cops get more annoyed and stressed with the situation. These bits are pretty funny and brief, which is how I wish some of the other side stories were handled. One is about this couple who starts robbing businesses around Kamurocho for the thrill of it, and a ton of the movie feels like it's dedicated to their melodrama, when they only ever briefly made eye contact with Kiryu and then run around being irrelevant to the plot. Kiryu doesn't know, care, or get affected by their actions in the film at all, and while I understand the value of including some characters with an outside perspective on things, who can show us what the city is like to the ordinary citizen and help characterize the lawlessness of the setting, In this case, the amount of screen time they get doesn't reflect the amount of intrigue their subplot brings to the experience. There's a good chunk of the movie dedicated to this assassin who's meant to kill Jingu. You'd think that would make him really relevant, but even though Jingu is in the movie and is Nagoshi for some reason, he has maybe 60 seconds of screen time, no dialogue, and just flies around in a CGI helicopter trying to find the end of the movie. So whether he lives or dies is of no concern to us as viewers because we don't know who this guy even is or why he's important. At most, this guy pours a drink for Kiryu one time, yet he's in 7 or 8 scenes contemplating life and death, and each time I'm like, wait, who is this? Not even Tetsuo the Iron Man can save these scenes, and he even gets intertwined with the robbing couple, and my mind just goes numb watching them interact. The issue is that Kiryu's story isn't actually simplified here to compensate for all this new information the film wants to present. The setup, backstory, and all the character relationships are the same, they're just glossed over heavily or never shown at all. When it comes to Kiryu's motivations, you're forced to piece things together through cursory dialogue between characters who already know each other and the situation, but aren't that interested in letting you in on it too. His relationships with Kazuma, Nishiki, and Yumi are huge elements of why he's on his journey, but I'm really not exaggerating when I say they each pop up for 1.5 scenes tops right at the end, yet you're expected to be just as invested in them as their game counterparts. I do think it's really clever how they introduce us to Kiryu beating all of these guys single-handedly, only to reveal that he's just looking for some dog food. We never see him meet Haruka or save this dog, we just hard cut to them feeding it, which is a well done use of contrast, but an example of how this film will skip over details of the game for the sake of style. Speaking of style, I think the wardrobe is pretty well done here. Kiryu's suit has a nice texture and flow to it, and it even has a unique design to the interior. Majima's jacket doesn't really look like it does in the game, but it's flashy and elaborate, which works in its own way. Haruka's skirt is this bright red that really stands out compared to everything else in the city. The movie is its strongest when it's having the characters go through these real environments, but there are a few bits that take place on sets which are noticeably fake and made of cardboard. Aside from places that actually exist in the city itself like the batting cages, there aren't really any iconic locations from the game. No Tojo HQ, Serena, or Purgatory, for example. Millennium Tower technically exists, but instead of taking place at this comfy bar Ares, Nishiki wants to throw down with Kiryu at Radek Academy. They also fused the Chinatown and bathhouse segments of the game into one part, which doesn't look like either of those, but does have some similar moments. Kiryu even gets a guy killed to protect himself from gunfire, just like the game. Kiryu watching this girl feed a dog in the busy streets of Kamurocho is such an iconic scene from the first game that really exemplifies how atypical its events are, and I think they do it justice here. This dog is actually way more present than in the game, following them around all the way through to the end, which makes them feel like a fun trio. It's a very charming premise to saddle this no-nonsense Yakuza with 2 allies who need his protection. This version of Haruka is really deadpan compared to her game counterpart, which is funny because now Kiryu seems more on the same wavelength as her. They both just stare when someone is going on about something they don't care about. These actors aren't trying to copy the characters of the game, but make the roles their own and fit what the movie needs from them. This is more obvious with Majima's actor, who isn't just trying to do his best impression. We spend a lot of time with him as he wanders through the streets looking for Kiryu, and while he's not that wild and energetic, he still brings that spontaneous brutality he had in the first game, and I think they do a really good job having him be comedic yet maintain a threatening presence. The film starts to operate on some kind of cartoon logic whenever he's on screen, and what's with all these jump cuts? That isn't me chopping up this scene. The whole movie is actually way funnier than the game ever tries to be. Everyone is a bit absurd, and there are plenty of tongue-in-cheek references to the game, like when they show off the health items. Kiryu even has heat, which was something that never actually appeared outside of gameplay. They even snuck a DVD of the prologue film into this scene where Majima visits a movie store. Yeah, people surprised that this movie exists will probably be even more surprised to find out that there was a 40-minute straight-to-DVD prequel film made a year earlier. This details the backstory of Kiryu, Nishiki, and Yumi growing up at Sunflower Orphanage and how the former two get involved in the world of crime. I'm actually not sure if this is meant to connect with the game or the film, since it does include a lot of stuff that fleshes out the plot of both. But Miike is listed as the executive director even though it was directed by someone else, so it must have been intended to relate to his film version somehow. I guess it could be both, which I don't mind since I think a lot of these scenes flesh out the characters of the game a lot more, and with the feature film, these are details you really need to know to understand what's going on with the story. Kind of a weird situation to have the setup of your film detailed in a DVD short film with completely different actors, a more serious tone, and reduced production values. But again, it feels like this wasn't the subject matter Miike was interested in with his adaptation. Nishiki's sister is actually shown here, and we even get to see the moment they realize she has some sort of illness. This makes it easier to empathize with Kiryu wanting to keep Nishiki out of jail to look after her, instead of his sick sister just being an off-screen plot device. We also get to see Kiryu give Yumi the ring from the game, showing just how long he's cared for her. This aspect of the story isn't acknowledged by Kiwami, which instead adds a new section to the first chapter where Kiryu buys the ring from a jewelry store in a flashback a few months before the game's events. He has to be reminded that it's her birthday and then only buys a ring because Reina suggests it. I think having this established a decade earlier makes the ring a bit more meaningful, and helps to show that the characters share a connection that spans across space and time. The fact that they haven't seen each other for so long yet she's still wearing it shows how much he means to her, and Kiryu returning it to her after a decade in prison brings everything full circle by the end of the game. Other notable inclusions in this film include seeing Kiryu and Nishiki brawling as kids, and we even hear them discuss what tattoos they'd like to get when they're older. It's interesting how Kazuma tries to stop them from joining the Yakuza. After all, Kazuma was a hitman for the Tojo clan, and he set up Sunflower Orphanage to take care of the children of his targets as a form of repentance. We see an example of this violent lifestyle during a shootout in the film's opening, so we know why he doesn't want to see them get involved in the same type of thing, making it all the more tragic when they insist on following in his footsteps. Yumi's parents are killed in the crossfire right in front of her, so when Nishiki kills Dojima decades later, it causes her to relive that traumatizing experience, and she loses her memory as a coping mechanism. I feel like having her memory loss tied to childhood trauma makes it more believable, but it's context like this that you wouldn't have if you hadn't seen this film. The game shouldn't require you to watch this to get these plot points, it should stand on its own, but it does show that there was more thought put into this story than you might have known. Elements like these give us more insight into the lives and actions of the characters of the game. After they move from the orphanage to Tokyo and join the Yakuza, we get Nishiki's reaction to first seeing Kiryu's finished tattoo. We also get to see them reuniting with Yumi years later, and how Nishiki loses track of her after Dojima is killed and Kiryu is arrested. He's played by a pro wrestler here, who is almost too jacked to be Kiryu, but he's a powerhouse nonetheless. He comes off as a lovable big guy, but I think the feature film does a better job capturing his attitude and how he doesn't want to be bothered with anyone's bullshit since he's on a mission. This DVD even comes with a bunch of cutscenes from the game, including an extended version of this funeral fight scene that Haruka views on a giant screen. Kinda cool to see some stuff that went unused in the actual game. I feel like we don't see a lot of that with this series. Well, bringing things back on track with the feature film, I've gotta say it's a mixed bag. I'm more fascinated by its existence and its place in the franchise's history as well as Miike's filmography than I am in it as an actual coherent story. It occupies a weird spot where I would definitely recommend it to fans of the franchise as a whole, but I don't think I could say it's a good movie by any general standards. So much of it feels aimless, and as a standalone work, its story lacks the context and setup needed to easily follow along without coming in with pre-established knowledge. At the same time, even longtime fans will feel like they fumbled some major plot points of the game. Its saving grace is kinda circumstantial, and that's the nostalgic feeling and novelty of being a live-action adaptation made at this early point in the series when it was still establishing its footing. It's a flawed oddity, but just like the first game itself, it's fun to be taken back to those humble beginnings. I can't in good conscience suggest it to the average person unfamiliar with the games, but if you already know what to expect, this could be enough of an alternative take on things to satisfy you. Honestly, the biggest takeaway from this video might be that you should probably watch that prequel film in conjunction with the first game since it fleshes out the backstory of the characters so much more. But hey, the feature film could be a good gateway to get you into some other Miike films and by extension, more Japanese crime cinema in general. Based on my intro, you could probably tell that I ended up finding a bunch of movies I like a lot more than this one by going through other movies in this genre for comparison and to get a better feel for Miike's typical style. A lot of them ended up being more interesting and stylistically gripping than this, and I'd actually be interested in covering them in the future. Until then, go give the French economy a boost by importing that Blu-ray so you can get the full effect of seeing the PlayStation 2 era Kamurocho in live action.